Really appreciate Jerry leading that song just a moment ago, because we're going to be talking about Moses this morning. We're going to be doing kind of a high-level overview of some of the stories in Exodus, particularly how they relate to Moses and his spiritual development. And so if you'd like to have your Bibles open to Exodus, you can kind of skim along to be able to refresh your memories as we go. What we're going to be talking about this morning is Moses and how he becomes who we think of him as. We often think of Moses as being this hero of faith, a great leader, somebody that we look up to for his relationship with God. But when Moses' story begins, he's not really that kind of person. In fact, he's not that kind of person at all. And so what I'd like for us to explore this morning is, how does Moses become a hero of faith? And similarly, how might we go through a transformation of faith in our own lives, just like Moses? And so where we need to begin is Moses' origin story. And you probably remember a lot of this story. If you recall, at the end of Genesis, all of the Israelites go down to Egypt to live with Joseph, who's risen to be second in command over Egypt. And things go really well there for a long time. They're prosperous and their families grow. But several generations go by, and a new Pharaoh rises to power, and he's afraid of the Israelites because they've grown so numerous that he's worried they'll try and overthrow the Egyptians. And what we need to see in the story of Exodus with Pharaoh, what we need to see throughout, is that Pharaoh is really a picture of Satan. He's a picture of evil and of the serpent. And when we see Pharaoh, he's really meant to represent the idea of the bad guy. And Pharaoh, because he's afraid of the Israelites, he does two things to try to control them. He oppresses them into slavery, and he starts to kill their male babies to basically control their population, and uses genocide to control them. And this should also give us a picture of the curses that are in Genesis chapter 3, that these are sort of a reworking of these same curses. And what we should see here is that just as the Israelites are looking for deliverance from Egyptian slavery, mankind is still looking for deliverance from the curse of sin. And it's into this situation that Moses is born. He's born during this time where Pharaoh is trying to kill male Israelite children. And so his mom hides him as long as she can. And then when she can't do that any longer, she floats him down the Nile River in a basket to where she knows the daughter of Pharaoh will be bathing. And Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses and adopts him. And Moses grows up not as an Israelite in slavery, but he grows up essentially as Pharaoh's adopted grandson. And he has the best luxuries of everything, probably the best education, the best food. And things for Moses, unlike the rest of the Israelites, probably went really, really smoothly. And so Moses, when he becomes an adult, is split between two birthrights. On the one hand, he's grown up as an Egyptian, but on the other hand, by blood, he is an Israelite. And the Israelites, who he's related to, his people, they've experienced a very different life where they are being enslaved and beaten and probably are not having enough to eat. And Moses hasn't experienced any of that. And you have to imagine that if the Israelites knew where Moses came from, they would have resented him. But in spite of this, Moses clearly still feels for the plight of his people, and he still wants to help them. And we learn a little bit more about this in Exodus 2, in a story starting in verse 11. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptians and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well. There's a couple really important things that we learn about Moses' character and who he is at this point in the story from this event. First of all, Moses wants to be a hero for his people. He wants to be a deliverer. He's looking to do that. And as he sees the Israelites enslaved, he wants to help them and be a rescuer for them. But he also doesn't know how to do that. He doesn't have any way to bring that about. And so the best thing that he can manage is to murder this Egyptian taskmaster. And so the first thing that we see Moses do is essentially commit murder. And what happens next also teaches us about who Moses is, because he tries to hide it. He tries to make sure that nobody finds out about this murder. But when it is discovered, he runs away. He flees. And not only does he abandon his Egyptian life, but he also abandons the rest of the Israelites. See, he's very comfortable to dream of being a deliverer when he's in a position of power and authority, but as soon as his neck is on the line, he is out of there. And he completely forgets about the Israelites and their slavery. And he spends the next 40 years of his life basically as a sheep farmer hiding from his past. And so when we first meet Moses, he's not a hero of faith. He's a murderer and a coward. It's at this point, after being a shepherd in Midian for 40 years, that Moses encounters God. And you probably remember this part of the story too. Moses is out keeping his sheep, and he sees this bush that's on fire, but it's not burning up. And when he goes to investigate, the voice of God speaks to him out of the bush, and God tells him that he's going to deliver his people, the Israelites, and Moses is going to be his prophet and speak to the Israelites and speak to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. There are a number of times in Scripture where people receive a calling like this, and I think of guys like Samuel or Isaiah, who, when the Lord says, I need someone to be my messenger, they are the guys who stand up and say, I'm ready to go. Here am I. Send me. I am your servant. Moses is not that kind of guy at all. In fact, he's exactly the opposite of that kind of guy. Because when God says, I want you to be my prophet and speak to the people for me, Moses tries to come up with every excuse that he can think of to get out of it. He says, well, I won't know what to tell them. I won't know what to tell them your name is. He says, well, they're really probably not going to believe anything that I have to say. Who am I? He says, well, I'm really not a very good public speaker. I'm not very eloquent or articulate. And at this point, God starts to get angry with Moses. And he says, look, your brother Aaron, he can speak. I'll tell you what to say, and you can tell Aaron, and Aaron will speak to the people. But essentially, God tells Moses that he's going to do this job and be his prophet. And so Moses goes back to Israel. And the Moses that goes back to Israel, the Moses we find in the passage that was read for us just a moment ago, is this Moses who doesn't want this job, this Moses who is a coward. But he goes and he speaks to the Israelites with his brother Aaron, and the Israelites are excited to hear what he has to say because they're looking for deliverance. They're looking for salvation. And so when Moses and Aaron come to them and say, God is going to deliver us out of slavery, the Israelites are excited, and they believe, and they worship God. And then Moses and Aaron go and talk to Pharaoh. And if we were shooting this scene for a movie, maybe we would shoot it where Pharaoh is, you can imagine him sitting on his throne, and he's looking really angry because Moses, the prophet of God, is about to come speak to him. And the palace doors swing open, and Moses walks in with his staff, and he marches up to Pharaoh with Aaron in tow. And he says, the Lord says to let the Israelites go. But Moses doesn't even want this job. So what I imagine happens is Moses and Aaron walk in, and probably Aaron's leading the way because he's the one who's going to do the talking. And Moses is kind of maybe cowering a little bit behind because he's afraid that somebody from his past is going to recognize him. And of course they eventually do recognize Moses as this outcast prince who fled Egypt. And they walk into this room to address Pharaoh, and Pharaoh can immediately tell that they're dead scared to be there. And they walk up and tell him that he has to let the Israelites go. And Pharaoh believes that he is an Egyptian god in the flesh. And now Pharaoh has Moses, this outcast, traitor Israelite, coming to him and telling him Pharaoh, king of the greatest empire in the world, that by the word of some Hebrew god that he's never heard of, he has to let the Israelites, his slaves, by the word of their God, he has to let them go. And of course, Pharaoh says no. And in fact, he makes things worse for the Israelites. He says, now in addition to your normal burdens of slavery, I'm going to make things harder for you. You have to make your own bricks too, and you got to gather straw and make your own bricks, and then do all of the work that you had to do before. And of course, this is an unreasonable request. The point of this is Pharaoh proving a point that if you challenge my authority, I'm going to punish you. And the Israelites now, who were so encouraged and ready to be set free, they lose heart completely. And they feel like fools for trusting Moses and for trusting God. Because if Moses had just kept his mouth shut, at least things wouldn't be as bad as they are now. And Moses is no more confident than the rest of the Israelites are. And at the end of chapter 5, he prays this prayer. Chapter 5, verse 22. Then Moses turned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all. And this begins a discussion between Moses and God about how this is going to resolve. Because Moses, although he's here doing the job because he has to be, he still doesn't really want to be here, and he still doesn't really trust that God's going to follow through. But in chapter 6, verse 1, God replies to Moses and says, But the Lord said to Moses, Now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he will send them out, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land. And God goes on to say, I'm going to do what I said I was going to do. The Israelites are my chosen people, and I'm going to deliver them. Tell the people that. And Moses goes to the Israelites, and he tells them that this is going to happen, that they shouldn't lose heart. And the people don't believe him because their spirits are broken by what Pharaoh has done. And then God tells Moses to go back to Pharaoh. In chapter 6, verse 10, So the Lord said to Moses, Go in, tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the people of Israel go out of his land. But Moses said to the Lord, Behold, the people of Israel have not listened to me. How then shall Pharaoh listen to me, for I am of uncircumcised lips? What Moses says to God in response is basically, hang on a second, God. I don't think you get what's going on here. I'm not sure that you grasp the situation, so let me clarify for you. The Israelites don't believe me, and they aren't listening to me. Clearly, I'm not qualified for this job that you've asked me to do. Pharaoh is never going to listen to me because I can't even convince the Israelites. How am I supposed to do this? I think that is a relevant feeling for us even today, because probably a lot of us have been in situations where things are hard and we're looking for deliverance from God. And not only does it feel like the deliverance is not coming, but it seems like things are actually getting worse. And we know on paper we're supposed to trust in God, but in our hearts it feels like maybe this is the one time God has made a mistake and he's accidentally assigned us a trial that was meant for a stronger Christian, and maybe we've accidentally been given something that we can't handle. And we're in this situation where we're feeling like, I'm looking to you, God, for deliverance, and it feels like things are getting worse, and it feels like I can't handle this. How am I supposed to deal with this? How am I supposed to do this? And Moses is struggling with this question because he hasn't answered the question that was posed previously. If you remember in chapter 5, verse 2, when Moses and Aaron first go to speak to Pharaoh, his response is, Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? And that is the theme of the book of Exodus. Who is the Lord? And this story is all about answering this question. And everybody in the story, whether they know it or not, is trying to answer this question. Pharaoh's trying to answer this question because he doesn't think that God is worth considering. The Israelites are trying to answer this question because God is supposed to be their deliverer. He's supposed to be their God, but right now things are really bad for them. And Moses is trying to be this leader that God's asked him to be, But Moses within himself has still not answered this question, who is the Lord that I should follow him? And what happens next is God's answer to this question, the 10 plagues that are brought upon Egypt. And I wish that we had time to go into detail on all of these plagues, but we don't. So what I would encourage you to do is to read through these plagues. It's a few chapters in Exodus sometime this week, and try to consider what it would be like to experience those plagues. But what I want us to talk about is maybe just the first plague and the last plague, to kind of get a sense of what the message was of these plagues. The first thing that happens, you probably remember, is the Nile River is turned to blood. And you can maybe even imagine what this would be like for us today, how scary that would be. Like you turn on your faucet in your sink and blood starts coming out, or you want to take a shower and there's blood coming out of your shower head, or you can't get water out of your fridge filter because blood is not designed to flow through a fridge filter, and so it breaks. And then maybe you go to the grocery store expecting to fight people over bottled water. And you get to the grocery store and the bottled water aisle is fully stocked. There's nobody there, and every single bottle of water is filled with blood because every drop of water that's come from the Nile River is turned to blood. And it would have been even worse for the Egyptians because their entire life is based around the Nile River. They worshipped the Nile River. They used it for food and for transportation, to irrigate their crops, and for drinking water. And so the first thing that happens to the Egyptians is God sends a message that I'm more powerful than your gods. I'm more powerful than the gods of the Nile River, and if I want to, I can upend everything about your life. I am the authority here, not you, Pharaoh. And then a bunch of other stuff happens, and it kind of escalates from things that would be really annoying and unpleasant, like frogs and fleas and flies, that maybe the worst thing that would really happen to you is you're losing a lot of sleep and you've got a lot of bug bites. And it gradually escalates from that into things that are more severe, like hailstorms and locusts that are destroying your crops and killing your livestock. And then the last thing that happens is the death of the firstborn. And there's a really simple way to illustrate the impact of this. If you are an oldest child, raise your hand. Even the kids can participate in this. All right, so if you can imagine, in one night, everybody who just raised their hand is gone overnight. If you experience that, where all those people in your life were suddenly dead, after everything else you experienced, your life is completely upended, that would change the way that you lived your life, and it would change the way that you thought about God. And that is the point of all of these plagues. There's two audiences for these plagues. So first is the Egyptians. And the message to the Egyptians and to Pharaoh is that God is more powerful than they are, that God is more powerful than their gods. But remember that Pharaoh is also a symbol of evil and of the bad guy. And so the message to the other audience, the Israelites, is that God is more powerful than their enemies. God is more powerful than their oppressors, and God is powerful enough to deliver them from their oppressors and to deliver them completely. And so finally, Pharaoh does let the Israelites go. And God leads the Israelites out of Egypt, and they take with them the spoils of the Egyptians. The Egyptians give them gold and jewelry because they cannot get the Israelites out of Egypt fast enough. And God leads them all the way to the Red Sea, and there the Israelites have to stop because God's led them there on purpose, and there's no way to cross the sea. And then we'll read what happens next in Exodus 14, starting in verse 5. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people. And they said, "What is this that we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel, while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. The Egyptians pursued them all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them and camped at the sea by Pi-hahiroth in front of Baal-zephon. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." And Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." This situation is very similar to what happens in Exodus 5. The Israelites are looking for deliverance, and it seems like things are getting worse. They finally made it out of Egypt and are on their way to the Promised Land, and now it looks like all of that was just to lead them to be killed by Egyptian armies. And so again, the Israelites, when they're put in this kind of a situation where things get worse for them, they lose hope. But this time Moses responds differently. And Moses the coward is the one who says, "Don't be afraid." Moses is the one who says, "God will fight for you." Moses has been changed at this point in the story. And the only thing that I can see in the text, the big thing that happens in between the Moses of Exodus 6 and 7 and the Moses of Exodus 14 are these plagues. These plagues have changed how Moses sees God, because now Moses has an answer to who is the Lord. And Moses sees that God is a God who defeats the enemies of his people, who defeats the bad guy and delivers his people completely. So this time, Moses' response is different. And there's something interesting that happens over the course of the plagues. You remember, Moses was afraid that he wasn't a good public speaker, and so God said, "All right, your brother Aaron can do all the talking. I'll tell you what to say, you can tell Aaron what to say, and he'll talk to the people." That kind of doesn't make sense, right? You're like, why does God need to talk to Moses then? Can't he just talk to Aaron directly? And in the beginning of the story, Aaron is the one who's doing all the public speaking. And you read phrases like, Aaron took the staff and did the signs. Aaron said to the people. Aaron said to Pharaoh. And as things progress, you start to read phrases like, Moses said to Pharaoh. Moses said to the people. And there's no clear transition. It seems like just Moses starts to do the thing that God asked him to do in the first place, and he doesn't need Aaron to be his spokesperson anymore. Moses starts to do what it was that God asked him to do. Because at the beginning of his story, Moses is very concerned about his own lack of qualifications. He's a coward, he's afraid to do this, and he's convinced that he can't handle it. And eventually he gets to the point, I think, where he realizes God's handling this. God is taking care of this. It's just my role to do the work that God's asked me to do. Moses stops trying to be a deliverer on his own, and he becomes the deliverer that he always wanted to be, just not in the way he thought he would be. And hopefully the application of that is relatively obvious. When Moses understands that God is a God who delivers his people, it changes the way that he behaves, and it changes the way that he lives his life. And when we understand that God is a God who delivers his people, it will change the way that we behave and the way that we live our lives. I feel like that point has been coming up again and again over the past few weeks in a lot of the lessons that various men here have been preaching. So maybe I'm belaboring the point, but I think it is a relevant point to belabor. Because although it's a simple concept that if we just trust God to deliver us, God will deliver us and we'll be better equipped to do the work that he's asked us to do, because if he's asked us to do it, then we can do it. That's a simple thing to understand on paper, but it's a really hard thing to get through our thick skulls sometimes. And it takes a lot of repetitions. And you even see that in this story. It takes 10 plagues for the Israelites to actually be able to leave Egypt. And Spoiler alert, right after this, even after God delivers the Israelites again, they're going to lose faith in him literally the next chapter. It's hard for us to understand that God is going to deliver us, but the more and more we understand that, the less we become like Pharaoh or like the Israelites, where as soon as things get bad, we lose faith, and the more we become like Moses, where we're put in these situations that are hard, and it's hard to see the deliverance, but in spite of that, we know that God will continue to show up for us, because God is a God who delivers his people. If we want to be people who can do the work that God has assigned to us, we have to be people who believe that God will deliver us from our enemies. And I want to end by reading what happens after they cross the Red Sea, because you probably know the story. Moses lifts his staff over the sea, and God parts the Red Sea, and the Israelites are able to cross through safely to the other side, and the Egyptians follow them into the Red Sea, and then the sea closes in on them, and they're all washed away. And once again, God delivers his people from the bad guys. He delivers them from the enemy. And I want to pick up right after where that happens. In chapter 14, starting in verse 30. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Then Moses and the people of Israel sang this song to the Lord, saying, I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his hosts he cast into the sea, and his chosen officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power, your right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrow your adversaries. You send out your fury. It consumes them like stubble. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword. My hand shall destroy them. You blew with your wind. The sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand. The earth swallowed them. You have led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them by your strength to your holy abode. The peoples have heard, they tremble. Pangs have seized the inhabitants of Philistia. Now are the chiefs of Edom dismayed. Trembling seizes the leaders of Moab. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fall upon them because of the greatness of your arm. They are still as a stone till your people, O Lord, pass by. Till the people pass by whom you have purchased. You will bring them in and plant them on your own mountain, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. The Lord will reign forever and ever. You see, the end of this story is that the Israelites and Moses know who the Lord is and why they should obey him. And not only they know, but the Egyptians know, and all of the other surrounding nations know who God is, that he's a God who delivers his people. And that's what I want us to take away this morning, because we're not in a battle with Egyptians. We're not oppressed by taskmasters who are forcing us into hard labor, but we are oppressed by sin. And the deliverance from that sin is not for us to be our own heroes, but it's for us to look to God who fights for us, to look to a God who reigns forever and ever. We serve a God who fights for his people, and that's the only way this works. if you're here this morning and there's any spiritual needs that we can help you with, we would invite you to make those requests known or talk to somebody after. But if there's anything that we can do to help you to come into a better relationship with the God who delivers, we would invite you to make those known as we stand and sing.